All right, welcome everybody. I'm Steve Parker with Archer, and welcome to another episode of DirectConnect. Very happy today to have a couple of special guests with us. We have Kelly Strand and Bryce Yonker from Grid Forward. Going to talk about what's next on the grid. Very, very interesting topic, and I've known Bryce for quite a while and been involved with Grid Forward, and Archer recently joined as a member. So we're excited to bring them on board and talk about what's going on in their world. With that, Bryce, why don't we start with you? Introduce yourself and talk a little bit about, you introduce yourself, we'll let Kelly introduce herself, and then you guys can decide who wants to give us the overview of Grid Forward.
Thanks, Steve. Bryce Yonker here. I run Grid Forward, an industry trade organization working to move grid modernization ahead. We'll talk a little bit about some of the areas we're working. I was an initial board member when we got this thing started back in 2010. I took on the first executive director role in 2014. So a little bit of history with the organization and the efforts we've been trying to drive.
Hey, Steve. Nice to meet you. I'm Kelly Strand. I'm deputy executive director at Grid Forward.
Bryce, why don't you mentioned you've been with the organization since the beginning back in 2010. Why don't you give us a kind of brief history of the last 13, 14 years, and then just let us know, what is Grid Forward today? What's it doing? What its key focus areas and mission?
Yeah, I'll let Kelly tackle a little bit of the stuff today and maybe add on, but I'll lay some of the foundation from where we got things started. So Grid Forward kind of started on the tail end the last time that the federal government was really going to be supportive of investing and moving the grid forward. So those of us close to it know that was affectionately known as ARRA. So when those resources were hitting the market, a group of industry individuals thought it was important that we could come together and rally support around moving the grid forward. So it evolved, more utilities, more tech innovators, more national labs and government organizations continually got involved. After a couple name changes, the latest organization took root in 2019. And so what we're primarily focused on is to drive innovation and modernization ahead by working with the parties that are primarily responsible for that. So electric grid utilities, technology innovators, and a wide array of partners that are outside them, whether it's a national lab or a state regulator or a regional nonprofit organization. We think it's a big tent that's required to really move this ball forward. So Kelly, maybe you can talk a little bit about some of the latest things that we've got in motion. I'll add a little bit on that as well.
Sure. So we really divide the work that we do into three primary pillars. We focus on community, information, and expertise. And expertise is the bucket that is changing the most rapidly these days. Expertise is the area where we are combining or creating opportunity for grid modernization policy input in looking backward. And then looking forward, we're actually trying to put together teaming submissions. So we had a hand in creating a couple of those this year. One of them is just about to hit the submit button, I think in the next 24 hours or so, around wildfires. And so that's a partnership group that has, I think it's 7 utilities, something like 5 or 6 different technology industry providers that are all focused around the concept of addressing, preventing wildfires however possible, primarily up and down the West Coast.
So the federal policy front has been a big thrust of late. We'll talk a little bit more about that, Steve, I'm sure. As you know, we organize gatherings, so we have meetings with our community, including our main Grid Forward event, and just do what we can to share the key information and updates and thought leadership that gives this community the information that they need to know to be acting in an effective manner to move advanced technologies forward on their systems. So that's us.
Excellent. So it's interesting. I do a lot of work in cybersecurity, and that's often thought of as being this, this cool, sexy kind of sort of thing. But the reality is a lot of what's happening in my world is old and boring, right? It's the transmission, the bulk electric system, and the old kind of standard things. So you're kind of on the cutting edge. And, when I think of security and reliability, and where the next frontier is in those. I think you guys are there now. You're building, you're designing, you have your hands in policy decisions on all that. So that's a big part of why I wanted to have you on for this conversation, because for my own benefit and the benefit of our community, having that eye towards the future, I think is very important. So we're ready to address some of those challenges that'll come our way. With that in mind, you hinted at a couple of the projects, but describe, how is the grid changing? And when I say grid, I'm thinking not just on the transmission side, but really out into distribution, all the way down to the homes. How is it changing? What are the key areas where change is happening?
Having just come out of a utility, I have a unique perspective on this. I think that we're seeing the grid change in a number of ways. First, we're seeing a huge thrust of decarbonization. A lot of that, what we're seeing there is the impact of electric vehicles coming onto the grid. We see a lot of electrification, and the portfolios that are being decarbonized are being stressed even further, right? So we're trying to identify new energy streams that are clean and able to deliver to our customers on an aging grid. In addition, we're seeing the expansion of distributed energy resources. So we're seeing more solar, we're seeing more smart devices that help manage a set of changing loads over that aging distributed grid. And all that, to me, all that is complicated by the fact that we have new tools, new data, new communications processes that frankly weren't available to us just 10 years ago. So a lot of this is changing really quickly. We're also seeing digitization coming along. I mean, utilities are changing everything from how they do their modeling all the way to how they actually deliver services to customers. And all of that is carried on the heels of these new tools and these new communications platforms. We're also seeing pretty significant endeavors in environmental justice, and we're seeing new players come into the scene as well. So we now have folks like electric vehicle manufacturers that are driving more and more of the conversation. So we see a number of changes. All of these are being played out over our grid. All of these are being played out in across policy and across regulatory frameworks, and then all the way down to the end user as well. Bryce, what would you add?
Well, you covered the broad brushstrokes. Maybe I can peel one or two back a little bit further. I think what's really in flux in the way that grid operators are running their system is the way that they're using information. We're kind of in a new information age on what's possible to understand with what is going on our grid systems. And so diving a little deeper onto the digitization trend that I think you laid out, Kelly, grid operators have a lot more visibility on what's going on in their system than they had 10 years ago, than they had 5 years ago. And how we turn data into actionable information is really an active part of the ecosystem right now. I think we're going to see a lot around the data analytics sphere coming from the utility ecosystem in the next couple of years. Like electric vehicles were kind of the killer app for opening up consumers' trends and interest on the evolving grid. I think we just barely dipped our toe in the water of what's transitioning on the grid as we put basically advanced metering infrastructure at most homes and businesses across the country. So that would be one thing. We could talk about all host of other new ways that grid operators are running their system. I think the democratization and the distribution of assets kind of being pushed out towards the edge is one that's really active, which I imagine we'll talk a little bit more about today too.
All right, thank you. Yeah, I just recently saw a slide. Someone was talking about grid and reliability, and I've had this thought for a while now. The grid is changing, and you can let me know if you agree with the statement. But we used to have a deterministic grid where we did what resources were necessary to provide power at all times, and we built that out, and we could dispatch those with the amount of renewables coming online and load changing. We're moving to a probabilistic grid, and which I guess you could say means we'll probably have power. But in all seriousness, it is. You talk about how information is being used and the way we're changing the way information is used and all this other data points. It does feel that way, that instead of building a grid that we know, right, scientifically we can run at all times, now we're relying more on probability, on markets and demand response and resource. We're saying we probably, most likely, hopefully, very likely will have enough power. Is that accurate? Do you understand what I'm trying to say? Is that, get a sense that that's accurate?
Absolutely. The way, I'll see if I can describe this accurately. The way that we historically have run our system was to forecast demand and dispatch generation or dispatch load. And that worked fine for a number of decades when we could reasonably predict the way that consumers were going to behave, and we knew what sort of large centralized physical assets we had to be able to count on. Today, that is somewhat flipping. I wouldn't say on its head, but certainly on its side, as we forecast generation or forecast what we're going to be able to dispatch and control load. And so we've really changed the way that energy systems are run. Scaling energy efficiency programs, scaling those to truly be dynamic demand side, demand flexibility offerings, understanding how to integrate variable resources at scales that are really rather significant. This is changing the way that we run energy systems. And exactly what impacts the reliable delivery of energy is something that's pretty complicated. We'll talk a little bit more about that later today. But of recent days, for many factors, really more complex than we've already gotten a chance to discuss today, reliability has been something that's been heading not in the right direction. So we can talk maybe a little bit about that later. But no, I think the way that you described it is a fair assumption.
Yeah, there's a lot of talk about the reduction in reliability that we've seen. I know NERC in their long-term forecast has raised concerns for significant parts of the country. The reliability isn't necessarily there over the long term that they've seen in the past. But let's flip that upside down, right, and look at from an opportunity perspective. Maybe in the process of changing the grid, we've created some problems. But with every problem, there's an opportunity to fix it. So what are the great areas of opportunity that you see that are being worked on right now within your sphere of influence?
I think some key areas of opportunity to maybe get headed in the right direction on grid reliability, for one, would be kind of the blocking and tackling of the way that we treat distributed resources. So, a couple decades ago, operators started dipping their toe in the water, some more reluctant than others, on efficiency being a true resource that they could use and they could tap into from their customers. And we have not used all of those resources by any stretch of the imagination. But what's getting really exciting these days is where we can take more comprehensive demand side programs and demand side packages, and use in customer flexibility in a way that it can wield itself at a significant scale on the system. So I think most people started realizing how real this was when we could control hundreds or thousands or tens of thousands of thermostats, controllable thermostats. But now, it's the early days of what that could look like for electric vehicles. Hot water heaters present a huge opportunity for the marketplace, and there's basically controllable anything. Pick the widget that's being used, and operators are going to be able to interface with that on a really significant scale, and dispatch that as a real resource and a resource that can help smooth out some of the bumps and valleys of the issues that they may be having with their system. Now, is a scale demand side program going to be able to help you ride through a multi-day outage? No. And I think that's one of the key things that's really, eating into those reliability numbers. So maybe we can talk about other opportunities there. But we have a lot of excitement around that area of opportunity in our realm.
Yeah, that seems interesting to me, and I happen to be in the process of building a new house, and I'm learning that almost all of the major systems are now connected to the internet. You know, they're monitoring your HVAC and the hot water heaters and all these other things. So I'm not 100% sure how I feel about having my utility control my appliances, but maybe for a small compensation, I could live with that. You know.
Yeah, and I think a lot. I think the secret sauce will be when people don't even know. You don't even know that your air is being changed a degree or two, and you're going to be compensated if it is. And if you don't want it to be, you always can override that. So I think one of the ones that is especially interesting to me is hot water. I mean, how often do you know what what your hot water is actually sitting there as? And that energy can last for quite some time. So pre using that, I think it kind of stands as a no brainer. So I think the programs that have the least amount of really interface or awareness that they're even impacting the lives of users, those are going to be the ones that are the most successful.
Are you doing anything around EVs? Because certainly the amount of energy that's in a car battery is orders of magnitude more than the energy that's stored in a tank of hot water, for example. Do you have any insights into how those may factor into load shaping and energy storage and things of that nature?
Yeah, Kelly, I don't know if you want to add anything to this, but I basically hear it being described as the amount of energy capacity that you have in those electric vehicles when it plugs in and is charging is akin to plugging in a second house, right? The sort of demand that it draws if you're wanting to charge it all instantaneously at that full force, it is akin to turning on all of the other sort of appliances that you would usually be using at a similar time. So the impact on the grid is significant, and the opportunity is also significant. It's pretty early days in North America for kind of the nirvana of a sort of a V2G or V2X as they're calling it now, realm where a grid operator might have the ability to tap into the capacity that's sitting in a vehicle latent. But I think it's going to come. I really do. I think we're going to find ourselves in a place sometime from now where consumers are comfortable with that idea because they're compensated for offering that level of flexibility. And operators have found a way to kind of aggregate those resources up and bring them onto the system at a significant scale. It is early days, Steve, right now on what that looks like in the marketplace. The OEMs are starting to try to get comfortable with what that can look like. If it does anything on warranties, that's been kind of a conversation for a number of years. But I see a trend really coming where electric vehicle infrastructure wanting to provide a resource as a grid flexible asset really seems like it is coming around the corner. I don't know if you have anything else you'd want to add there, Kelly.
Yeah, Steve, when I think about electric vehicles, I see them both as a challenge and an opportunity, frankly, and I think they are across all sectors. Um, Bryce touched on how some of the residential models will probably progress, but there are also other pieces in place in this very, very complicated pie, right? There's commercial loads and there are fleet loads as well that'll probably help uh, as we see them electrify, they'll also help the level of comfort around the country increase as we see more and more of those fleets begin to transfer from gasoline engines, internal combustion engines, all the way over to electric vehicles. Um, and those are going to come with unique and interesting partnerships with utilities. We're going to see, charging at night programs. We're going to see charging during the day type programs. We're going to see load filling programs. So we're going to see a lot of flexibility, and that in itself, I think, is going to begin to add to how kind of the conversation continues at a residential level too. And so I think that there will be an increased level of comfort. There are also huge amounts of effort up and down, at a minimum, the West Coast that I'm aware of, to try and build out the charging networks. And those charging networks are anything from, a 5 to 10 minute charge all the way to a slower process. So the chicken and egg question is always, does charging infrastructure enable people to actually electrify their vehicles, or is it the other way around? Um, and But at a minimum, I think the data shows that that level of comfort actually increases and enables people to decide to make that purchase. So I said that it was both a challenge and an opportunity. I think there are a lot of models that we will begin to see, and a lot of our members are working really hard on this, and they're coming up with some really interesting solutions because the impact on the grid is massive. It's a huge hurdle and opportunity.
I'll just reiterate one other thing. Probably my favorite idea within the realm of electrified transportation and the role that it can play on the grid would be with school buses. So if you think about the way that a school bus operates, it's on a scheduled time. It's typically being used really only during those times. And it would lend itself really well to be able to be a grid flexible asset outside of those times. Not to mention, those school districts would really benefit from having an additional revenue stream for given all the budget challenges that educational institutions do face these days. So as school buses are electrified and coming in literally at like megawatt scale loads, it's a grid relevant resource, basically with one unit. And if a school district has multiple of them, or multiple schools have multiple of them, you're bringing in things that, when they get aggregated, are really going to make a big impact on the way that we run systems. And it just seems like such a natural partnership between utilities, school districts, and just a good win-win all the way around. So we're really excited to see these buses coming in. We hope the manufacturers can keep up with the orders. We know there's a very, very high amount of demand, and we think that could really kind of pave the way as to vehicle flexibility providing vehicle assets providing grid flexibility can be proven out pretty well.
The fascinating discussion. I do want to get into challenges, and Kelly, you had mentioned that EVs bring both opportunities and challenges. But first, I was thinking about economic models for all this, and we're already at a point now where people, I think, are becoming comfortable with the kind of the app-based economics. We see with Uber, with Airbnb, we're used to sharing things, and so maybe someday there'll be an app. I don't know what the name would be called. If we think of a good one, we should trademark it, right, Bryce? But an app for demand response in your home, and people start monetizing their laundry or something. Who knows what could happen in the future? But let's go to. We
should definitely figure out how to monetize our laundry.
We should definitely absolutely do that. We'll see. I know. I plan to have a backup generator at my new house, and I'm thinking, I'd be happy to turn that on and sell power back to the grid at $9,000 a megawatt hour if needed. So those sorts of things are of great interest to me. But let's talk about challenges. You've laid out a lot is happening. It's kind of mind-boggling to see, and I always love chatting with you because I don't get to see into this world on a daily basis. What are some of the key challenges? And maybe we go back to EV and talk about some of those or other areas that we need to overcome to really get where the vision is for the grid of the future.
Yeah, I think that there are lots of challenges on scaling EVs, but I'll take it up a level from just EVs and talk about challenges in general to driving advanced solutions ahead on the grid. Kelly, you can bring something different, and then I'll maybe keep the ball rolling. But my first challenge is the challenge of changing the status quo. And these grid operators have done things in a certain way for a long time, and getting in and changing that is no feat to be underestimated. The friction to overcome the way that things have been done and kind of readjust, change management, trying to bring in innovations of culture. This is just a not insignificant task of kind of turning the barge, if you will. It doesn't pivot really quickly. I'll add on to that the fact that, as most of your listeners will know, distribution utilities are little regulated monopolies, right? And so whether they're an investor-owned utilities and are regulated by the state, or they're a public utility and overseen by their local board, the hurdle to prove that the investments that you're making are justified and prudent ones on areas that are less well known, or maybe are well known, but just adjust the way that you're doing your business is, again, not to be underestimated. So the regulatory friction, whether it's, at the state level or from some other jurisdiction, is a very significant hurdle to overcome in this space. Kelly, I know I only mentioned two there. I don't know if you want to elaborate on either or drop in anything else.
When I think of challenges, the first thing I thought of was value stacking. And Bryce, I think you hit that with the second one, but essentially the ability to make a case for the grid modernization that is needed at the particular time in the particular place and stack up all the values that you're going to get and deliver those to your customers, whether it's a member-owned utility or an IOU, but to be able to translate those into values for your customers, man, sometimes that can be a real big lift, particularly with the type of regulatory framework that the various utilities we work with have to go through. But the other thing I was thinking about was the fact that, frankly, the way that utilities operate is changing day by day. And we've seen a lot of this come through actually in wildfire mitigation recently. Today, utilities in the southern parts of the West are operating with these periods where they actually turn off the power. They're doing PSPS pauses. What are they called? Public safety power shutoffs. And this is a completely different way of operating your business. Think about it. A utility earns revenue based on how many kilowatt hours or kW you actually deliver to the customer. And now we're asking those utilities to say, stop. Please don't buy our product or don't expect our product to come to you for a period of time. And so we're seeing pretty significant changes in the way that utilities are being asked to operate. And a lot of that runs back to liability, right? A lot of that is changing in the way that those utilities are regulated and governed. And so there are some big changes afoot.
So we talked about, we talked about culture and policy and regulatory structures. I think you pull it forward into financing platforms and business model. I basically list all of these challenges before I talk about anything technological. I think that there's actually not a whole lot of friction on accelerating a lot of these solutions on the system from a technological standpoint. Sure, they exist, but they are lower on the list than a number of these other areas that I think are really the ones that are slowing down the deployments, whether it's deployments of bringing EVs onto the grid or deployments of rolling out a demand side program. We haven't talked about some of the most cutting edge things like rolling out a DERMS platform. Acronym shouldn't have more than 3, but rolling out a distributed energy resource management type system for your utility. All of these, I think, are not being hampered significantly by technological issues. It's almost always something that we've talked about with these other levers.
Interesting. And you anticipated what I was going to ask a follow-up question. So I have kind of 5 broad areas of challenges I wrote down. I have regulation, I have politics, I have culture, I have economics, finance, and then technology. So I guess you answered that technology is not the problem. It's all of the other structural aspects of that, which is...
I rarely find the technological issue being the one that's holding back the deployment. These solutions are amazing. The things they can do typically far exceed the expectations or the specs of something that a buyer would want. But they do adjust the way that they do business, or it's changed from the way they historically had done it, or they're going to make revenue in a different fashion. And you just got to overcome those barriers, and they're very not insignificant. They just don't change overnight. We're right in the thick of the messy part of this energy transition with regards to how these solutions come in. Because frankly, performance-based regulation is going to have some way, shape, or form in almost all markets. Selling a kilowatt hour, not all kilowatt hours are the same. Time and location and various attributes of that are going to matter, and they're going to matter on the way that you sell your resources and the way that you manage their grid and the decisions that you make for managing your grid. So that's just the quick and dirty version of the really exciting landscape that's unfolding right now.
Yeah, I can speak from personal experience and some of the changes. Kelly mentioned the public safety power shutoffs, and I live in one of those zones, so I got to experience a couple days without power last fall during one of our dry wind events up here in Oregon. Fortunately, in Oregon, we don't get those very often, unlike in further south in the west.
And California has been getting brutal. It's absolutely nuts, and I actually think that they made a really good call on the PSPS in Oregon State for the first time they did it. But yeah, I mean, I think the knee-jerk reaction there was to overreact because of the liability potential. But it's a tool that needs to be in the toolkit when we're trying to deal with really extreme circumstances in the ways that our grid interfaces with communities and with all of us. Hopefully we're going to be doing a lot less of the PSPS and using some more advanced solutions to minimize that. But I don't think that cat's out of the bag. I don't think it's ever going to be fully put back in. And I wouldn't argue that it should be, actually.
All right. Well, I'm going to pivot a little bit and talk a little bit about my world, get your perspectives, and I don't necessarily expect you to have a great deal of knowledge or insight onto specifics, but I'm curious, what your impressions are. You're obviously dealing with people that are working on the forward progress of the grid on a daily basis. When it comes to things like cybersecurity, even physical security to an extent, and reliability challenges, what are you hearing in your community? How big of a conversation is that? How much thought or concern are they putting into that as they design and envision this, this new grid that we have in mind?
I would say that when it comes to deploying an advanced grid widget, I don't care what it is, just pick the tool. Pick the MS, as I say, whatever that management system might be, whatever that new software package might be. If it doesn't come to the table with an answer to how is it addressing cybersecurity, it tends to be a non-starter, right? So these solutions are opening up, yes, arguably maybe a higher number of vulnerabilities on our system, but I would say that the operators are reasonably mature understanding that threat and know that they have to have cybersecurity addressed on all of the solutions that they bring in this regard. Now, does that mean we're creating a system that's more or less cyber secure? I think it's hard to argue that we aren't creating a system that has more possible places to be potentially attacked, right? So there's more vulnerabilities. But as we head to a grid that is more dispersed, has more agility and ability to flex and find resources from other areas, I tend to think that it's going to be a net gain for the overall system. Because in the past days, if you had a international nation state that was trying to hack down our system and maybe is trying to take down a central generator, well, maybe they get access to a handful of HVAC systems and you eventually find out the issue. But at the end of the day, it's not going to impact your grid as much as it would have to take down like a coal facility. So I think there probably will be more vulnerabilities, but I do think that the industry is keenly aware how important cyber is on all of these applications that come in, and it hopefully will get the attention it deserves. We advocated for larger support, for example, federal funding. We said you're funding grid modernization programs to these billions of dollars, and you're only funding cybersecurity to these hundreds of millions. You really need to upgrade that a little bit. So I think there are some areas of funding maybe at the federal level we'd like to see a little bit higher. But in general, I can assure you, every conversation we ever have about some advanced solution, somebody has a question about cyber, and we never kick them out of the room. It's not an inappropriate question. It really needs to be there.
To add what you were saying, or maybe to debate you just a little bit, I'm curious. You mentioned, a bunch of distributed energy resources. You said HVAC systems coming online, et cetera, and being, flexed up and down, probably up. We've been having this conversation about EVs. I'm curious at what point, what saturation of EVs under control of someone else, perhaps in the middle of the night, what it would take to actually compare to a coal plant? I really don't know, but that number is, it takes a lot fewer electric vehicles than it takes home HVAC systems, right? So just a curious thought, and I don't have an answer. Um, but yeah, to your point, we're certainly seeing a whole lot of physical security issues in and around the Pacific Northwest. I know a couple of utilities have had their electrical substations be shot at, and so that's happened here. That's happened, I think, on the East Coast and the South as well. So we're seeing a number of kind of scary trends there where there's gunfire, and I know that utilities, certainly that's a physical security thing that utilities are seeing very stridently, and they're also seeing a lot of theft of copper. So the combination of those has a lot of attention of utility executives. From what I can tell, they are, not only is it outrageously dangerous to steal copper, it's also of course very expensive for the utility to have to replace. And so there's a lot of effort going into the physical security of substations and other locations that are owned by utilities. And so that's been certainly a theme that I've heard over the course of the last year or so, Steve.
Excellent. Bryce, I think I probably agree with you, which might seem odd coming from a cybersecurity person, but I think that, balancing the risk reward is important. And I think you're correct. We are building more risk or more vulnerabilities perhaps into the grid, but we're also gaining rewards, and we have to look at the overall balance. And I think we've accepted the risk in many other areas of our lives because the reward exceeds what the risk is. And so I think we're probably hopefully we're gonna be in that place with the grid and not having a adverse risk reward ratio on that.
Well, the analogy I make, Steve, is banking. Is banking fully secure now that it's digitized? Of course it's not. Do any of us want to physically go walk into a bank to do every single transaction that we would have to do now? Nobody does, right? So I think it's the way that we run our electric system in parallel will be somewhat akin to the way that banking digitized, really some time ago. And you're not going to ever go back. You would never imagine even dreaming of going back. Are there going to be issues that come along with it? There undoubtedly were. It will be, including stuff we couldn't even possibly imagine. But the way that we run our energy systems and the way that we see the benefit from that, whether it's getting value from us homeowners or us business owners on the way that we run our system, so just more visibility to integrating renewables at much, much higher levels. I think, in all host of examples, of course, we're going to want to go there.
Excellent. Well, this has been a very interesting and insightful conversation. Before we wrap things up, I do want to give you a chance to talk about your annual event. I understand you've got one coming up this fall again. Plans might not be entirely set, but what can you tell us about that? And if people listening to this are interested in attending, what should they know?
Our main event's always in the fall. We're working on the firm date. Hopefully it's October 17th and 18th. We're working on the firm location, potentially around the wider Portland area. The theme this year will be on embracing disruption. We've had recent themes around power to the consumer or ensuring a resilient 21st century grid. But there's disruption all around us, and the way that we really embrace that and turn it into some productive transition, I think will be a really exciting one. So that's going to be our focus this year, coming in October, details to come later. The other pitch I would make is that we do our annual meeting usually in June, and we're looking to do that next to a very, very exciting event where Formula One race cars are racing around tracks on fully electric drivetrains. So stay tuned for that as well. That would be June.
Awesome. Well, thank you both for joining us. This has been great. I think our audience is going to be very interested to hear, learn more about Grid Forward. Thanks again. And Bryce, I'm sure I'll see you again in the very near future. Thank you and have a great day.
Yeah, thanks for having us. Take care.
Thanks, Steve.
Stay up to date on all the videos we release here at Archer by clicking on the subscribe button. Click on the bell to be notified right away when we release new videos. If you know of a topic or someone you think we should talk to on DirectConnect, please let us know in the comments below.